The Game Boy Advance had no right to be as good as it was. A handheld with no backlit screen, two shoulder buttons, and hardware roughly equivalent to a Super Nintendo. And yet the RPG library it accumulated over its lifespan is genuinely one of the best the genre has ever seen on any platform. Some of these, at least one you probably missed, but all of them deserve your time. Golden Sun is the GBA proving what it could do when a developer decided to take optimizing for the hardware seriously. Camelot built a full-blown JRPG with a world that felt genuinely large, a summon animation system that pushed the hardware visually, and a magic mechanic, the Jin system, that was inventive enough to anchor a two-game series around it. You collect elemental creatures called Jin, assign them to characters, and the combination determines each character's class and available synergy abilities. Detach them mid-battle to boost your stats at the cost of that class, or unleash them in summons for devastating elemental attacks. The system rewards tinkering and planning in ways that most JRPGs don't ask for. What I remember most clearly about Golden Sun is how it treated the world as something worth exploring on its own terms. The towns had lore, NPCs had actual thoughts, rather than placeholder dialogue. The mind reads synergy, which let you access the unspoken thoughts of every character in the game, wasn't mechanically essential, but felt like a reward for curiosity, delivering characterization the main dialogue didn't bother to explain. The dungeons were full of environmental puzzles that used the synergy abilities cleverly, making each new power feel like a genuine key to the world rather than a stat bump. It's also true that the first game ends at an awkward narrative midpoint. The full story requires the lost age as well, and without it the resolution feels absent rather than deferred. The villain's motivation also stays underdeveloped throughout. But as a demonstration of what the GBA was actually capable of, and as a JRPG that built something genuinely its own rather than imitating what came before it, Golden Sun remains one of the best arguments the handheld era produced for the genre. Aria of Sorrow is the best Game Boy Advance Castlevania, and a strong argument for its place among the best Castlevanias made. Set in 2035, a futuristic year that felt exotic at the time, it follows Soma Cruz, a student transported into a solar eclipse that turns out to be Dracula's castle, suspended in time above Japan. The premise is deliberately strange and commits fully to its own weirdness while still delivering the tight Metroidvania exploration and combat. The Soul system is what separates Aria of Sorrow from Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance that preceded it. Defeating enemies has a chance of granting their soul, which functions as a permanent ability, passive buffs, additional attacks, special movement options. Over 100 enemy souls are available, and assembling the combination that suits your playstyle is the game's most satisfying loop. The tactical soul system creates genuine inventory management decisions. Some souls are rare, some synergize unexpectedly, and discovering that a specific combination unlocks a new ability is the kind of discovery that Metroidvania design does better than any other genre. The castle design is excellent. The layout rewards backtracking. New souls open previously inaccessible paths, and the pacing between combat rooms and exploration sequences is well calibrated. The twist on Soma's identity is telegraphed enough that engaged players will anticipate it, executed cleanly enough that it lands anyway, is one of the better story moments in the series. There are limitations in the GBA hardware's audio compression, which diminishes a strong soundtrack. The 2004 DS follow-up Dawn of Sorrow expanded on everything Aria built, but this is the foundation that makes Dawn of Sorrow's improvements feel meaningful. Boktai is a Hideo Kojima production, and that fact explains everything remarkable about it and some of what's frustrating. Designed for Konami in 2003, it embeds a UV light sensor into the GBA cartridge, meaning Django, your vampire hunting protagonist, is literally powered by the actual sun. The gun Del Sol won't charge in a dark room. Bosses can't be purified without sunlight. The game tracks time of day, adjusts enemy strength accordingly, and makes birds audible in the morning. It's the most committed hardware integration a major developer attempted on a handheld. The gameplay underneath is a stealth puzzle action RPG. Dungeon rooms with enemies to avoid or confront, keys and switches to find, block puzzles to solve, and a series of immortal bosses to weaken and then drag to outdoor pile drivers for sunlight-powered execution sequences that require the sensor to complete. The solar energy storage system between missions means you can bank sunlight and spend it later, which is the game's concession to players who can't always play outdoors. Solid Snake appears in the second game, because of course he does. Some dungeon puzzle design, particularly the math-based block puzzles, feels like padding. Enemy variety is thin and the level structure repeats more than it should. Playing on original hardware today means the sensor has likely deteriorated on most cartridges, making emulation with software solar simulation the practical option. But no game before or since has made going outside a mechanical requirement, and the commitment to that idea is genuinely singular. Boktai is the most interesting bad idea the GBA era produced. Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga is the Alpha Dream debut that proved Nintendo's own IP could be the foundation for something genuinely experimental. The two brothers controlled simultaneously, one on each shoulder button, navigating both overworld and battles as a linked pair. Sounds like a gimmick that would exhaust itself within an hour. Instead, it sustains an entire game because they built the world and the combat around the dual control mechanic at every level. Timing-based attacks, jump chains, brothers moves that require both characters in sequence. The system keeps generating new applications of the same basic idea right through to the finale. The writing is what makes it memorable. This treats the Mario universe with an irreverence Nintendo rarely permits. Bowser becomes an unlikely travel companion. The Bean Bean Kingdom is populated with characters that exist nowhere else in the franchise, and villain Suage Cleta and her assistant Fawful have more personality than most antagonists in games 3 times the budget. Fawful became a fan favorite for reasons completely apparent on first encounter, but the difficulty balance dips in the back half. Some boss fights arrive with escalating complexity that the game's tutorial infrastructure doesn't fully prepare for, and if you haven't been timing canceling attacks consistently, the late game can feel punishing in ways the early game didn't signal. The overworld puzzles using the brothers' different abilities are also occasionally unclear. But Superstar Saga is the template every Mario RPG since has been measured against, and most of them haven't quite reached it. Sword of Mana is the GBA remake of Final Fantasy Adventure, the 1991 Game Boy original that started the Mana series. Rebuilt by Brownie Brown with new graphics, a dual protagonist structure, an expanded story that gives both the hero and heroine separate campaigns through the same events. Playing both reveals perspectives that neither alone fully explains, and the shared world takes on different forms depending on whose eyes you're seeing it through. The action RPG combat is faster and more fluid than the original, and the ring menu system translates the series' trademark interface to handheld without losing what made it comfortable. The Mana Spirits system builds magic around elemental companions, each granting different spell categories and scaling as your relationship develops. The weapon growth system, which improves proficiency in swords, spears, and other types through use rather than equipment, gives the action combat a progression layer that pure action games rarely bother with. The lore connections to the broader Mana series, explaining how this setting preceded Secret of Mana, give series fans a genuine payoff. This has the weakest action of any game in the series. Enemy AI is basic, combat variety is thin, and the difficulty stays low enough that most encounters feel like processing rather than engagement. The story expansions introduce pacing issues the original's tighter structure avoided. The soundtrack by Kenji Ito is good, but compared against Hiroki Kikuta's Secret of Mana score, an unfair competition. But as a reimagining that respects its source while genuinely adding to it, Sword of Mana earns its place at the end of a remarkable library. Final Fantasy VI Advance is the portable version of a game that many consider the finest entry in the series, and the GBA port holds up as the cleanest way to play it outside of emulation. The World of Ruin, the second act following Kefka's successful destruction, is the structural choice that defines what makes it extraordinary. Most RPGs treat the villain's threat as something to prevent. This game lets the threat succeed, scatters the cast across a broken world, and rebuilds the party from grief rather than purpose. Reassembling the party in the second half is optional in structure, which makes the emotional weight of each reunion feel earned rather than scripted. The Esper magic system opens access to spells across any character through summoning, which creates a depth of customization the fixed class structure of earlier Final Fantasies couldn't match. The writing across the ensemble cast is the real achievement. 14 characters, most of them with more personality and backstory than many games' singular protagonists. Seals' opera scene remains a landmark of game storytelling, not because of technical achievement, but because it earns its emotion through the narrative context the game builds for it. The score is Nobuo Uematsu, doing some of the most ambitious work of his career in 6-channel Super Nintendo audio. The GBA version specifically added 4 optional espers and a new dungeon, the Dragon's Den, which contains the hardest optional content in the game and gives completionists something substantial beyond the main story. The honest trade-off is that the GBA audio compression slightly diminishes the soundtrack compared to the SNES original. For a game whose music is as important as FF6, that's a real compromise, though the content additions soften it considerably. Lufia: The Ruins of Lore is not a great game. It's a competent one with a handful of genuinely good ideas that get undermined at every turn by the development constraints of a side project handled by a team that wasn't the original Lufia crew. Set 20 years after Lufia 2, it follows Eldin, Torma, and Rami as licensed hunters, adventurers for hire, who stumble into a global conspiracy involving ancient ruins and a power-hungry warlord. The story is serviceable and the roster is likable enough, even if neither reaches the depth of the series' better entries. The job system is the game's best feature, a class structure that lets characters specialize across swordsman, fighter, thief, priest, mage, and chemist trees, mastering base classes to unlock advanced ones and carrying skills across transitions. Combined with the monster capture system, where enemies can be collected via discs, trained, leveled, and eventually fused with characters in combat, there's more mechanical depth here than the game's modest reputation suggests. Routes between towns function as dungeons in themselves, cleared once and then converted to fast travel nodes. A clever design that reduces backtracking while keeping the world feeling connected. The limitations are significant enough to have earned the game its mixed reception. The dungeons run long, without the puzzle design that made 2 memorable. Slowdown in a turn-based RPG shouldn't exist, but does. The story never builds to the emotional stakes the name implies, and the series connection is superficial enough to feel incidental. But for a player who has exhausted the GBA's better RPGs and wants something that rewards patience with its systems, Ruins of Lore has more to offer than its reputation gives it credit for. Fire Emblem: The Blazing Blade was the first game in the series to reach the West, and it arrived in 2003 without much fanfare for a franchise that had spent 17 years being Japan exclusive. The tutorial campaign, following Lin's story, was designed explicitly to introduce a genre that Western players mostly hadn't encountered, and that gentle opening is followed by 2 interlocking stories of considerably more depth and difficulty. Other campaigns cover the same war from different perspectives, with Hector's route unlocking additional chapters and a harder difficulty that rewards the player who commits to understanding the system. Permanent character death is the game's defining design choice, and still the element that separates Fire Emblem from every other tactical RPG genre. Losing a character means losing them. The game continues, but the unit, their supports, and their story beats are gone. That risk transforms each map from a puzzle to be solved into something with genuine stakes. I've reset for characters who weren't even on my main team because I developed an attachment through support conversations, a chain of optional two-character dialogue sequences that build relationships and unlock stat bonuses. It's an elegant system that serves double duty as character development and mechanical reward. On the flip side, some chapters have luck-dependent early turns that punish aggressive play in ways that feel cheap rather than designed. The magic system is also notably simpler than later Fire Emblem entries, with fewer weapon triangle interactions to consider. But as the game that introduced the series to the rest of the world, and as a tactical RPG that made permadeath feel like a feature rather than a punishment, the Blazing Blade holds up more cleanly than most of its peers. Mother 3 never received an official Western release. It came out in Japan in 2006, 2 years after the GBA's commercial peak had already passed, and Nintendo quietly let the localization opportunity expire without explanation. A fan translation team spent years producing an English patch that Nintendo has never acknowledged and never shut down, which is as close to tacit permission as a fan project tends to get. Playing it through that patch is the only option available to most players outside Japan, and it's worth taking. What Mother 3 contains is one of the most structurally unusual RPGs in the medium. 8 chapters told from rotating perspectives, beginning as a quiet story about a rural community and expanding into something that becomes genuinely difficult to describe without spoiling. The emotional register shifts in ways that very few games attempt, moving from comedy to grief to dread, and back with a confidence that suggests a creative team that knew exactly what they were building. The final chapter in particular is structured in a way I've never encountered anywhere else and earned a response from me that I wasn't expecting from a Game Boy Advance game. The battle system uses a rhythm-based attack timing mechanic. Hitting the A button in sync with the enemy's attack animation reduces damage. That sounds trivial, but becomes satisfying in extended play. The Magypsy characters and their relationship to the Needle plotline represent the game's most conceptually ambitious element. The gameplay, however, is less mechanically complex than Earthbound. The battles are simpler, the world smaller, the systems lighter. But Mother 3 is playing a completely different game with what an RPG is for. Riviera: The Promised Land is a Sting Entertainment RPG that commits to a design philosophy most games wouldn't have the nerve to attempt. Every resource is consumable. The inventory cap is 16 items, and you can only bring 4 of those items into any given fight. Equipment doesn't just have durability. It has a finite number of uses before it disappears permanently, and the same items that serve as weapons also serve as healing. Every battle is a resource management problem, and every item you carry is a decision about what scenario you're preparing for. You play as Ein, a grim angel sent to destroy the floating paradise of Riviera, and then immediately rendered amnesiac and adopted by its inhabitants. The story is Norse mythology filtered through a visual novel structure, with branching dialogue options that track relationship values with 4 companion characters and determine which ending you receive. The affection system isn't cosmetic. It shapes which companion takes the critical role in the final chapter, which means the conversations you have throughout genuinely matter to the outcome. The GBA version added voice acting, new CG scenes, and a reworked soundtrack that the original WonderSwan Color release didn't have. Riviera's pacing demands patience before it reveals why it's worth the investment. The early chapters are slow, the combat feels constrained before the overskill system opens up, and the fixed scene exploration, where you choose which objects to examine in a given area with limited interaction points, will feel alien to players expecting free movement. But the music is genuinely among the best on the system. The art is exceptional for the hardware, and the game that emerges after the first few hours commits fully to what it's set out to be. Tactics Ogre: The Night of Lodi's is the GBA prequel to the legendary Super Nintendo and PlayStation Tactics Ogre title, and it's significantly better than its subordinate position in the franchise's history suggests. The story follows Alphonse, a young knight sent to suppress a rebellion on the island of Ovis, who gradually discovers that the order he serves and the cause he's fighting for are both more complicated than his briefing suggested. It's a political fantasy with real moral weight. Characters are motivated by conviction rather than malice, and the war crimes you may or may not commit are treated as choices with consequences rather than cutscene flourishes. The emblem system is its most distinctive contribution to the genre. Characters accumulate specific combat conditions, killing enemies with a certain weapon type, landing a specific move a set number of times, and meeting those conditions unlocks emblems that permanently modify stats and unlock advanced classes. The system rewards building characters around coherent fighting styles, and discovering what a new emblem requires mid-campaign adds an investigation layer other tactical RPGs don't attempt. The class tree is deep enough that multiple play-throughs offer genuinely different party compositions. The biggest limitation is production value. The GBA hardware shows its constraints in battle animations and map detail compared to the SNES predecessor, and the story lacks the sheer scope of tactics. Ogre, let us cling together. The translation also has occasional roughness, but as a portable tactical RPG that understands what makes the genre compelling, genuine moral stakes, deep character building, and missions where preparation matters, Knight of Lodi's is one of the best on the platform. Pokémon Emerald is the definitive version of the third generation. The version that took the already excellent Ruby and Sapphire and added enough to make replaying the same region feel worthwhile. The Battle Frontier is the reason Emerald is on this list rather than its predecessors. A post-game facility with 7 distinct battle facilities, each with their own rule set, their own challenging AI trainers, and a difficulty ceiling that occupies competitive players for hundreds of hours. The Battle Factory, where you draft rental Pokemon and adapt to a team you didn't build, is specifically brilliant, demanding genuine understanding of the mechanics rather than just a trained-up favorite roster. The Hoenn region itself holds up better than most of its contemporaries. The sense of scale from the early game through the open ocean routes is something the series has rarely replicated since, and the gyms are consistently well-designed mechanical challenges rather than simple level gates. The weather mechanics adds a layer of environmental strategy that Kanto and Johto never attempted. The added Team Magma and Aqua rivalry in Emerald gives the villain's storyline more cohesion than Ruby or Sapphire managed individually. There is one criticism that applies to the whole generation rather than Emerald specifically. Physical and special moves are determined by type rather than the move itself, which creates some genuinely illogical matchups that later games corrected. Some of the water route pacing is also punishing in a way that hasn't aged well. Encountering a tentacle every 4 steps for 20 minutes of ocean navigation was frustrating in 2004 and remains frustrating now. But Emerald is the peak of what Generation 3 could be, and the Battle Frontier alone justifies its place here.